so excited for this episode because we're going to look at natural language processing, the natural language acquisition paradigm, and what is evidence-based and what is not evidence-based. This session is going to focus on intervention. The last session focused on assessment. Now, I argued in the last episode that much of what you see in the natural language acquisition phases of language development is in fact evidence-based. We know that children with autism, many of them do begin with echolalia, with repetitive speech. And over time, that echolalia becomes more mitigated, more spontaneous in nature, and then the language becomes more spontaneous and generative over time. You're additionally going to see greater diversity in the verbs that are going to be used. You're going to see greater diversity in the morphology. You're going to see greater diversity in the syntax or the type of sentences used. You're also going to see the sentences get longer, more complex, and build into narratives. So this is very much evidence-based, and this is a great way in evaluating gains over time for children with autism who are learning to talk. This is great to apply at the preschool level. What Marge Blanc does is combines Prizon's work in echolalia and how echolalia becomes more spontaneous over time with Laura Lee's work on the developmental sentence scoring, which looks at the morphological and the syntactical changes that you're going to see over time. She combined the two. They are both evidence-based. They make sense. It is good practice for Monday morning to evaluate the progress that your children are making, using that as a guide in what you're looking for. Now, today, we're going to jump into the intervention, and we're going to look at the natural language acquisition paradigm, whatever words you use to describe it, Gestalt language processing, and where is there evidence to support it? Where is there evidence to not support it? Now, there's a lot of meta-analytic research coming out currently that is saying there's a lack of evidence for Gestalt language interventions. Now, the reason for that is quite simply there isn't a published Gestalt language intervention program to be researched. So it's hard to research something that isn't published. So I can research an approach for speech known as Easy Does It for apraxia. I could research dynamic tactile temporal cueing that is published. It shows me these are the steps. This is what you do. I don't have that. I don't have a step-by-step intervention published plan to research. So it's very hard to say that Gestalt language processing approach is not researched when there isn't an approach to research in the first place. First, we need a published approach, but I want to look at the 5 areas that were recently raised in an autism journal article by Courtney Venker and Emily Lorang, 2025. And these are 5 areas where they say, whoa, let's pull back the reins on endorsing this as an evidence-based practice because there's a lot of flaws that we're really going to have to look at before we embrace it. And they bring up 5 areas that I think we should all talk about and consider so that we can do better. If you listen to the Preschool SLP, you know that I am not a bandwagon speech-language pathologist. I do not drink the Kool-Aid of any approach out there. I'm the first to tell you that every single published approach that we have available at our fingertips has its weaknesses and it has its strengths. Every single approach has aspects that are not evidence-based and has aspects that are evidence-based. We are going to fine-tooth comb Gestalt language processing, looking at Courtney Venker and Emily Lorang's recent article in the Autism Journal and say, what are weaknesses in Gestalt language processing? What are weaknesses in the natural language acquisition? Because our goal, once again, is to be like a swan, which is to swallow the milk that nourishes you and to spit out the dirt. There is no such thing as a perfect program. And if you're working with children with autism, if you're not taking an all of the above eclectic approach, the research kind of indicates you're missing the bus. The meta-analytic research, numerous studies have found the most effective approach for treating or for helping children with autism spectrum on the autism spectrum is eclectic in nature. It takes the active ingredients from multiple approaches. Today, we're going to look at these weaknesses that were pointed out in the natural language acquisition paradigm by Courtney Venker and Emily Lorang. Now, Courtney Venker right now has millions of dollars of grants input preschoolers with autism benefit from. Do they benefit from telegraphic speech, or do they benefit from longer, more complex utterances using more diverse vocabulary? Now, Courtney Venker has done research in the past at Vanderbilt. A whole crew of them at Vanderbilt have done studies on this, and they have shown that diversity is the spice of neuronal life for the children with autism. That caregivers who spoke with more diverse vocabularies, who used longer, more complex utterances, had better outcomes with their children with autism than those who used fewer words and shorter utterances. So we're going to have to find out what comes out of her later study. I'm emailing her right now to get her as a guest on our podcast to see what is happening in her lab, because there's a lot of NIH money going on over there, and she's working to answer some very important questions on what kind of linguistic input children with autism benefit from. I'm excited to see what they find in these current studies. Nonetheless, let's dive in to her 5 criticisms of the Gestalt language processing approach, or the natural language acquisition paradigm, and how we can take these criticisms into consideration when it comes to what we're going to adopt on Monday morning. So the first one was a lack of empirical research. Now, she talks about, how do you know someone is a GLP, a Gestalt language processor, versus an analytic language learner? There's no test for that. There isn't the take this assessment and this says that you are a GLP, and we have reliability and we have validity to support this, and you are an analytic language learner. I can see where she's coming from. Should we be saying your child is a Gestalt language processor based on, where's the test for that? So I think that is a very valid point that she brings to the table. Instead, what you want to do is you want to look at the speech itself. What percentage of the child's utterances are exact repetitions? You want to keep that data. That's going to become very important when it comes to getting a baseline for where their language development is. And it's going to become really important for seeing the progress that they're making. You're going to say how many utterances were exact repetitions in this 25 continuous language sample of utterances that we have. Now, we're hoping that 6 months down the line, you're going to see less percentage of exact repetitions. You're going to see more mitigated echolalia, in which the utterances change a little bit. You're going to want to see more diversity, in which they're not saying the same sentence over and over again. That's a good sign of progress. The research has made that clear. But should you say your child's a Gestalt language processor, your child's an analytic language learner? That's really reaching when there's no reliable or valid assessment for that. So let's watch what we're saying when we don't have the evidence to support making this differentiating and to label children as being a certain way. Now let's dive into the second criticism in this article, and that is that you're saying this child is a Gestalt language processor. Now, processing, how you process language, is something that happens neuronally that you would need neuroimaging to see. Her argument here, and once again, it's about what language you're using. You're saying this child is a Gestalt language processor. Do you have neuroimaging to know how they're processing language in the brain? Are you doing eye tracking research in which you say a word and you see that the child is looking in that direction, that they're processing that language? And she looks at other areas such as event-related potentials, functional neuroimaging, probably some EEGs. Okay, we don't have that in clinical practice. So her point is, don't use the verbiage processing. unless you can actually assess what they're processing. You do not know their processing. You do not know what's happening in their brain. So making it very clear that a language sample, which is about what the child verbally expresses, does not give you any clues into what the child is thinking, what the child is processing in their brain. This is a really good reminder to clinicians to look at your language that you're using, and maybe you want to say, for instance, the spontaneous language sample indicated Gestalt expressive speech. And then you can give examples of that. And let's look at the third criticism that was raised of Gestalt language processing. And this is about the definition. So she talked about Gestalt language processing being used to describe repetitive chunks of language in which you have scripts or you have phrases. But then she says later on, it's also been used to describe words or sounds. Now, I think this is fair. We don't have this operational definition we can use on a universal level. When I think about gestalts, I would use it synonymously with echolalic speech, with repetitive speech. For instance, when a child is learning to talk, and gestalts are great, right? Our neurotypical children use gestalts when they're learning to talk. And they point to the cat and they say, duh, because they think it's a dog, okay? They fast scripted this four-legged creature is a dog. You call it a dog. Duh, that's the animal. You don't ignore it. You say cat. You respond, yeah, that's a cat. You can't say meow, meow. You're going to respond and you're going to take that ball that they threw your way. You're going to catch it and you're going to throw it back at them. It's all about that back and forth interaction. Now, children with autism, you can say they use gestalts too. They can go and point to the cat and call it a dog. You see the four-letter creature, you call it a dog. That's what I've memorized. And then over time, that's going to become a cat. But you're going to respond to it. They threw the ball to you. You're going to throw the ball back. Gestalts are great. We've all used gestalts when we're learning a language. You might be thirsty and you might say agua because you're at a bar ordering a drink. You think agua means drink. Agua. You're using a gestalt. It's at a single word level. They're going to tell you the word for beer. They're going to say cerveza back to you. They throw the ball at us. It's great. Gestalts are great. We all learn language using gestalts. We wouldn't know our ABCs, 1, 2, 3s if we didn't gestalt it and sing it a million times. And then later on, it becomes generative. Gestalts are great. We always need to embrace Gestalt speech. And I think, yes, you can look at gestalts as phrases. Yes, you can look at gestalts as scripts. Yes, you can look at gestalts as words, and then sometimes it's going to be gestalts as sounds. So for instance, a child comes up to me and they want me to sing the Old MacDonald song, and they say E-I-E-I-O, and that means, can you sing the Old MacDonald's with me? It's a gestalt. It's a memorized E-I-E-I-O. E-I-E-I-O means Old MacDonald had a farm. That is the third criticism, which I think is fair. Yes, we need to be consistent. What are we talking about? Is gestalts the same thing as echolalia? Can gestalts refer to chunks of language as well as single words and single sounds? I think if we're going to talk about gestalts, we just have to say it's repetitive speech. It's repetitive speech that we use and we repeat from one context to the next. It is what it is, and it's good. Gestalts are good. We need to embrace gestalts. That's the child throwing the ball our way. Don't stop that game. Continue that back and forth interaction. Give them the model, expand upon what they said, and throw that ball back. Okay, now we're going to look at the fourth criticism of Gestalt language paradigm in this article, and that it may lead people to underestimate what autistic children understand. Research out there say that children with autism do understand on a word-by-word basis what they're saying. And for us to say, well, this is a gestalt, they really don't understand what they're saying, but they kind of understand it on a superficial level. So they're singing their favorite song about Bluey to express that they feel happy in this context. They don't really understand what they're saying. And who made you the mind reader? You really, just like she said before with Gestalt language processing, do you really know what's going on in their brain? And here she's saying, do you really know whether or not they're comprehending what they're saying? Maybe they know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying X, Y, and Z. That's what I'm saying. But you think that I'm saying something different, that you know better than I do, whether or not I comprehend what I'm saying. Once again, it's that idea of being presumptuous. Now, when we take this, I do think it's a really important point because many children with autism have a speech motor disorder. They might not be able to say what they generatively wish to say, but they have something that is motor planned, programmed, and executed multiple times. So they're able to say X instead of Y. They know they want to say Y, but they don't have the motor planning in their mouth, the motor programming and the execution in their mouth, much like a child with childhood apraxia of speech, which is estimated somewhere near 25% or more of children with autism or minimally speaking have. So this is a good point. We don't know what they're thinking when they talk. Once again, that idea of maybe not using this idea of Gestalt language processing. What are they processing? Just saying, this is what they're doing. It's repetitive speech. Why is this repetitive speech happening? Is it because of a lack of comprehension? Is it because of a lack of speech motor development? Where is the breakdown occurring? We don't know. And making the assumption that it's a lack of comprehension is kind of going beyond what we can measure. So it's a very good point that is made in point number 4, which is, do you really know what the child wants to say? Are you a mind reader? So it's all of this idea of knowing what you can measure and what you can't measure. And you really can't measure their comprehension based on what they're expressing. You don't know what their intent is. You don't know what they want to say at the end of the day. And even from a speech motor control, you don't know if it's that they simply don't have the motor planning, programming, execution to say the new word that they want to say, which I do sometimes when I was in Spain. It's like, I know that you say it like X, like this, but I can't say it like this. So I'm going to use the word that I know how to say. And it's really an issue in the mouth. That word has a couple crazy hard trills in it. And let's use this word instead. Let's go on to number 5. Number 5, the 5th criticism in this article is the most important for us to pay attention to and to consider in our practice. Like I said before, I know of no published manual that I can pick up off of a shelf. Not that I'm that type of therapist that picks up a published manual off the shelf and follows it. That's what a technician does. If you're a therapist, you grab the active ingredients from multiple approaches, you consider the child in front of you, and you do something different depending on who you're with. However, if there was a manual on the shelf, which there isn't. So people that are saying, okay, Gestalt language interventions, they don't have the research base. You don't have the intervention to research in the first place, to be fair. However, they point out some very important points here that they say that they've come across in Gestalt language interventions that are simply do not do's. One of them is this idea that there's times where you should not use a single word when communicating with a child, and that's because they're at a certain level. Now, this idea is not evidence-based. There's no research out there that says, uh-oh, don't you dare use a single word with this child. This is going to hamper their language development. There's no study out there. Of course, as I mentioned before, caregiver input that is longer and more complex generally is input that is better language gains for the child. So the second area that they bring up here is a great concern, which is saying using non-grammatical speech. No, don't use grammar at a certain level and don't use verbs at a certain level. Now, I'm not saying that Gestalt language processing interventions that they advocate for that. I'm not saying that the natural language acquisition approach advocates for that. I haven't seen this. In this article, they point this out. They say that the research indicates that grammatical speech, not telegraphic speech, is more beneficial for children with autism. And they are right in that. The research indicates that more diverse use of verbs is better for children with autism. And they are evidence-based, empirically supported by saying that. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not putting any natural language acquisition program down, Gestalt language processing program down. I have not seen this program that has said, do not use a single word utterance. Do not use grammatically correct speech. I haven't seen that. So if this is the case, I would say, oh, that's not good. There's no research to support that. Or there's no research to support using caveman talk or telegraphic speech with children with autism. And I would say, and there isn't research to say that you should have never used a single word utterance with a child with autism either. That's not evidence-based. However, I don't have a published program to say, and they put it right here. So this almost seems like hearsay. As I said before, you have to be very discerning with what's out there. Telegraphic speech is just not a good thing for children with autism. And anyone who says that you should never speak at a single word level if the child's talking at this level, communication is more dynamic than that. There's going to be times where it's appropriate to say a single word. There's going to be times where it's appropriate to speak in long sentences. It's a back and forth exchange. It's very dynamic. There's no rule. It says never use a single word. I think when we look at these 5 areas that are brought up by Venker and Lorang, I think that the whole idea is be discerning with everything that you come across. And don't be a black or white bandwagon thinker. Don't be someone that's saying, I'm all phonics, or I'm all whole language, and I'm in this camp or I'm in that camp. Be eclectic in your methodology. What I'm saying is when we're looking at this article, she brings out some very important points. Should we be labeling children as Gestalt language processors or analytic language learners and put these labels on the children when there's no assessment to determine what type of learner they are that has any reliability or validity? Be careful with the language you use. Describe not the child, but describe the behavior that you see. The second area pointed out, should we talk about Gestalt language processing? Well, processing, you can't measure processing unless you have neuroimaging and unless you're doing eye tracking, eye contact tracking, in which you say where the child looks at the word. So Gestalt language processing, maybe that's a word you shouldn't use because that's something that you cannot measure. The third area that she brings up here is the definition of gestalts. Okay, what is a gestalt? Is a gestalt a repetitive sound, word, phrases, script, piece of a conversation? What's the definition here so that we can all communicate effectively with one another and research what we're talking about here? So once again, when I think about gestalts, I think of this as repetitive language use. So this is something that I see on a language sample, exactly repeated. And it's going to be repeated in a non-contextually appropriate way or an inaccurate way, like I say, an overgeneralized way in which the cat is being called the dog. And that's how we all learn language. So when that does happen, the worst thing to do is to ignore it and extinguish it. Someone threw you the ball. You got to throw it back. You're going to model the correct form, respond, interpret what they said, and respond. It's all about that back and forth interaction. So then the next area that we should look at is underestimating, well, what do they comprehend? Well, they're saying this because they don't understand that this is a dog, this isn't a cat. Well, that this is a cat, this isn't a dog. Well, maybe they don't have the speech programming to say cat. But they know that they're conveying to you, I know I want to say cat, but I can't say it in my mouth just yet. I totally comprehend that. Once again, being very careful about talking about someone's ability to comprehend or process based on what comes out of their mouth. We're not mind readers. But I think the 5th point is most important, is don't jump on a bandwagon and be non-discerning and take every aspect of any intervention program out there. So every intervention program out there, you need to say, this is what's evidence-based. This is what are active ingredients. I know the research says this is what works. This is what I'm going to take. This is what I'm going to leave behind because the research says don't do that. You're going to look at things and say, yeah, the hair's kind of going up on my neck, but the research says don't speak in telegraphic speech with children with autism. I'm not going to do that. But you know what? It does make sense to measure how much of their speech is repetitive. It does make sense to measure the diversity of their vocabulary, the diversity of their morphology, the diversity of their syntax, and whether or not they're developing narrative skills as their expressive language develops. Language samples are a very powerful way to measure gains in communication development for children with autism. Make no mistake about it. And you would be very much amiss if you do not evaluate repetitive speech. What percentage of their utterances are exact repetitions of something they said previously? You're going to want to see a decrease in that. That does not mean Gestalts are bad. Gestalts are great. You are going to take those Gestalts and you're going to respond to those Gestalts because this is the child with autism throwing the ball to you, saying, I want to interact with you. I want to talk with you. And you are going to respond to that because if you want to improve their communication development, the more they talk, the greater the gains. We know that from the research. Frequency matters. And if they talk to you and you ignore it, they're going to talk less. So respond to Gestalts. Many of the children I work with have learned to talk through Gestalts. They've learned to talk through singing their favorite songs. They learned to talk through reading their favorite books, the repetitive ones like Brown Bear, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, which is why I embrace them so much in my SIS membership. They've learned to talk through saying ABCs and 1, 2, 3s till they're blue in the face. They've learned to talk through saying the shapes, anything that they're obsessed with, dinosaurs, scripts from movies. That's how they've learned to talk. And the reason for that is because the more consistent you're able to produce speech, the better the outcomes. So for instance, when I've had children who are obsessed with letters, and I've been able to come to a point where I can pull out a letter and they can come up with that letter that on a consistent basis. And I point to it in the hallway and I point to it on the floor of the carpet. And I point to it on the wall in the classroom. I point to it in the book. This is the child who suddenly is consistently saying bye-bye and consistently labeling common objects. And it's just an amazing growth spurt that happens with that consistency in speech development. Why that happens, I believe, is you're creating neuronal tracks from the cerebellum to the prefrontal cortex that need to communicate in order for expressive speech to voluntarily occur. And the more the child is saying, I want to say that letter A, and I'm going to say it right now, it's like prefrontal cortex. I have an idea, say the letter A, cerebellum. Okay, this is what needs to happen for you to make this complex motion to happen. It's happening. You're building those neuronal tracks. And then suddenly other words become so much easier to say. Consistency is the key to success when it comes to expressive speech development for children with autism. Gestalts are the bridge that are going to get you there. So thank you to the authors, Courtney Venker and Emily Lorang, for your article that you've given us in the areas of concern with Gestalt language processing so that we can be discerning in the work we do on Monday morning. That said, do what you do best, which is to roll up your sleeves and make the world a better place, one child at a time. You will always be first.